Do Chinese companies present opportunities or threats? The debate has launched impassioned op-ed pieces on both sides of the argument recently, especially in the U.S., where trade tensions with China have cast a shadow on seemingly all things Chinese, from 5G technology to international students to basketball games. On the one side, you've got people who say Chinese companies can offer consumers new options, often at a better value. On the other side, people are afraid of the competition or of perceived links between Chinese companies and the Chinese government. So what can the U.S. and China take away from both sides of the debate? Is the sentiment really so black and white? And what do the arguments say about the bigger China-U.S. relationship? I've got Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics again, and from Philadelphia, U.S., Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of the consulting firm Grasshopper Strategies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, two recent pieces clearly illustrate this debate. The first, pretending all Chinese companies are evil schemers will only hurt the U.S. economy, published by the Washington Post on November the 9th, and the second, published in Forbes on November the 12th, China's grand plan to take over the world. Just from the titles, we see two sides of the argument that basically boil down to Chinese companies have evil intentions or they're just doing business. John, your take.
Well, it's clearly, business is a business. Chinese companies are no different from any companies in the world that they are for-profit organizations. And we have to keep in mind that Chinese companies also include many very competitive private companies. They have nothing to do with the Chinese government. They expanded overseas over the years to seek business opportunities, including the U.S. market. So at the end of the day, the accusation that Chinese companies are somehow different in a way that is sort of connected to China's government, China's government's ideology is totally groundless in my opinion. Companies are for-profit organizations, maximizing profit, maximizing shareholder value is any company's operating philosophy, and Chinese companies are no exception to that.
But there are people, there are people who would say, you were talking about private companies, Chinese private companies or companies that have been listed somewhere in the stock markets, but what about the so-called state-owned enterprises, or companies that have other kind of links with the Chinese government? Are they also the kind of companies that are just interested in maximizing their profits?
Well, I mean, SOE, the state-owned enterprise, that's called SOE phenomenon, it's just not unique in China. I mean, Europe, for example, has tons of SOEs. So, SOEs are also for profit. SOEs in China, in particular, the large SOEs controlled by the central government under the control of an organization called State Asset Supervisory and Administration Commission. It's exercised the shareholder right on behalf of the states, and they send the people sitting on the boards of these companies. And the mission is very clear, for-profit organizations again. So I think, even SOEs, and many SOEs in China actually compete in competitive markets. They have nothing to do with the government's protected industries, and they are, in my opinion, they are no different from any other private companies. As a matter of fact, I also want to add a note that the SOEs companies in China actually do not fit very much the typical categorization in economics textbook about SOEs, such as being fat, being efficient. Some of these companies are very competitive, actually. I can give you tons of examples of these companies like that.
Actually, I was in a dairy company in Beijing, and they told me, the managers told me, being a state-owned company actually restrained their scope to seek profit, because they're supposed to think more about social responsibility precisely because they're a state-owned factory. So, for instance, they can't sell the milk to a higher price that they would want to, because otherwise it would look bad, it would harm the ordinary people's affordability of dairy products. So, Brandon, what is your take of this kind of, for me, it's very black and white, it's very, good versus evil look at Chinese companies. Actually, not just Chinese state-owned companies, so long as they come from China, for some American people or people in other Western countries, they pose a threat.
Well, first of all, I think you're right that too many people are trying to default this to a black and white or a good versus evil or a China versus U.S. or one system versus another. And the reality is it's way more complicated than that. Even the two articles that you bring up, the one in Forbes and the one in the Washington Post, they both start from ideologically extreme places in their titles, but actually very quickly move towards the center when they start saying, like, look, you know, Trumpism that sort of treats China as China Inc. and they're all quote-unquote bad doesn't work. That kind of trade tariff for everybody is just costing American consumers money. But if you actually dig into some of the more detailed aspects of the differences in the China model of economic growth and the United States' model of growth, you do see fundamental differences. This is where I would disagree with my colleague in the studio in saying that China's socialism with Chinese characteristics, a concept founded by Deng Xiaoping, carried on currently by Xi Jinping, is an economy based on central planning still. It utilizes capitalism formats. It utilizes private enterprises to increase innovation and investment. And it does promote global trade and integration, but it still is very different. Even from your own story, where you talk about an SOE saying, look, we'd love to raise our prices, but we know that it's not just shareholder value, it's not just profit that drives us, it's a social good. And once you start changing that model to include other goals, you end up with fundamental differences between the United States and China.
Okay, we're not going to define.
Not necessarily, but there are differences nonetheless.
I understand. I understand. But the point here is not to define exactly what this creature is, the Chinese economic model or Chinese companies, but whether these companies, right, whether these companies pose a threat to the United States, to other countries, or they are, you know, just a Chinese way of doing business, probably, maybe Chinese way, but nevertheless doing business, because are they breaking any international law? Are they breaking any international norms? That's the kind, and are they encroaching on other people's legitimate rights and interests? That's the question we have to be asking. John?
Well, I think, again, I want to point out that SOEs is not unique to China. I mean, Europe has many SOEs, and what Brandon is talking about is the economic system. It's very different from companies themselves. Regarding SOE's operation, we actually have committed to the principle, at least the central bank president, Mr. Yi said that we are going to treat these SOEs under the principle of what's called competitive neutrality. It's a concept promulgated by the OECD. It's a concept that many SOEs in Europe have been operating under. So in that regard, you know, the competitive neutrality principle, for example, sets aside, you know, several principles of neutrality. One thing being the fact that companies need to separate their social responsibilities, these social government obligations away from the company's operation. So there are certain rules and principles that SOE is supposed to follow in a way that they don't function as different as from private companies. So I think in that regard, you know, this overly bloated accusation against Chinese SOEs are totally ungrounded. Now, having said that, I think that what the Washington's accusation of SOEs in this aspect has more to do with the rising technological prowess, the increasing competitiveness of Chinese companies, including SOE companies, and this debate is framed in the context of, you know, we against them, we capitalists against communists. You know, this is totally wrong. I mean, companies from China, they operate just like, you know, private companies in the United States.
Yeah. Well, Brandon, I'm going to ask for your view. My humble view here is, you know, for me, it's very strange to read these articles because we look at any foreign company, any Western company, just as what they are. We never think, oh, they're from, you know, a Western ideological system, so they must be some kind of threat. No, and I think the great majority of Chinese people also see companies, foreign companies, as mere companies. Brandon?
I would disagree with that to some extent. That's a pretty, very optimistic view. I mean, I lived in China long enough to see culturally people react negatively to Japanese companies. Culturally people react negatively to American companies. I've seen on-the-ground regulations and enforcement that treat wholly foreign-owned enterprises as separate from Chinese-run government. We have requirements for joint ventures over the last 30 years. What we're seeing today is really a paradigm shift, because that's different. Let's talk about what we're actually seeing today. A lot of the concern brought up by the more rational members of the U.S. leadership, and I don't mean the Trump cabinet or administration on this, talk about data, like TikTok. I was on this show and I said, look, TikTok is under scrutiny not necessarily because it's Chinese owned, but because it's a large social media platform. And Facebook is under scrutiny, and Apple is under scrutiny, and Google are under scrutiny. 3 companies that are completely American, still under scrutiny from the
under
U.S.
the
Congress.
same
So
pretext
TikTok,
of national
with its hundreds
security?
of millions of users,
But Brandon,
is also under scrutiny.
Brandon, I totally disagree with you. I think Chinese consumers love American companies and Japanese companies. Let me finish, Brandon. I think Chinese consumers love American companies and Japanese companies. Just a day ago, look at the Double 11 event here in China. $30 billion of merchandise was sold on internet. And the largest foreign companies, Japanese companies, American companies, they sold most to the Chinese market. I think
Costco.
Exactly. I mean, the idea that the Chinese consumers somehow have a grudge against American companies is just totally untrue. Just go to Starbucks coffee. Look at GM sales here in China. This is I totally disagree with that.
Yeah, I think there's too many things being mixed in here. Basically, the authors who wrote that article didn't have all of these in his mind. His view was a little bit more simplistic, and one of the central ideas that's quoted in that is that China has a grand dream of world domination, and it's part and parcel of communist ideology. Basically, China want to take over the world, when with its economic rise. Brandon, what's your view?
I think China has a nationalistic stream to be a powerful nation. Does that mean domination over others, or does that just mean prominence in a world economy? I'm going to go with, I think it's at least going to be prominence, and that's not a bad thing. All countries that are growing, that are prominent, that have power, that have economic well-being and wealth should desire to have influence and position and prestige in the world. And China, the United States, Europe, countries in Africa should be no different about that. Ambition is not the problem here.
All right, so it's not part and parcel of communist ideology, it's part and parcel of every capitalist society. Okay, very fast.
Well, I think this debate is very unfair. When American companies expand overseas, it's about spreading American ideals about free trade. When Chinese companies expand over the world, it's framed as domination of the world. This is totally ideology at its very best. I mean, this is totally unfair. I can't say enough about the ideological value behind this kind of a statement. It's totally unfair.
Okay, let's continue this argument some other time, but it has been a very interesting one. Gong and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, thank you so much. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.